In 2019, a field biologist named Karina Schiaffino waded chest-deep into a flooded savanna in the far northeast corner of Paraguay and counted something that was not supposed to be there. Through the reeds, standing in water that reached just past its black stockinged legs, was a marsh deer, then another, then 5 more behind it. She pulled her binoculars down and stood still in the water for a long time. 14 years earlier, a national survey had concluded that the marsh deer was functionally gone from this stretch of the Paraguayan Pantanal. Poachers had taken the adults. Cattle ranchers had drained the marshes. Roads cut through the floodplain had fragmented the last corridors that allowed these animals to move between seasonal feeding grounds. The survey had recorded fewer than 24 individuals across an area the size of a small European country. The species was not officially extinct in Paraguay. But everyone who worked in the field understood what the numbers meant. So what Schiaffino was looking at in that flooded savanna did not make sense. Not a handful of survivors clinging to the margins. A herd, healthy, breeding, expanding into habitat they had abandoned a generation ago. This is the story of how Paraguay took its last viable marsh deer wetland, closed every road leading into it, posted armed rangers at the perimeter, and watched as one of South America's most threatened large mammals began rebuilding a population that conservation models had written off as unrecoverable. To understand why this matters, you need to know what was lost. The marsh deer, Blastocerus dichotomous, is the largest deer species in South America. A mature male stands nearly 4 feet at the shoulder and stretches close to 6.5 feet from nose to tail. It can weigh up to 130 kilograms. Its antlers, which branch into as many as 10 points in older individuals, are shed and regrown annually. But the feature that defines the marsh deer is its feet. Unlike almost every other deer species on the continent, the marsh deer has elongated hooves with interdigital webbing, an elastic membrane stretched between the toes that functions like a snowshoe in reverse. Those webbed hooves prevent the animal from sinking into the soft mud of its wetland habitat. They make it one of the most efficient wading ungulates on Earth. The marsh deer evolved to live in exactly one kind of landscape: flooded savannas, seasonally inundated grasslands, and permanent marshes where the water sits between 30 and 60 centimeters deep. It feeds on aquatic plants, water lilies, and emergent grasses. It moves with the flood pulse, following the water as it rises and recedes across vast floodplains. When the water is high, the deer retreats to forested islands. When the water drops, it fans out across the open marsh. This seasonal migration is not optional. It is hardwired into the species. Cut the corridors that allow that movement, and the deer cannot adapt. It simply disappears. The marsh deer once ranged across much of tropical and subtropical South America, from the southern edge of the Amazon basin to northern Argentina. Its distribution defined a vast arc stretching east of the Andes through the great river basins of the Parana, the Paraguay, the Araguaia, and the Guapora. In this immense range, the marsh deer was the keystone herbivore of the floodplain. Where it grazed, wetlands stayed open and diverse. Where it disappeared, a few dominant plant species choked the waterways, and the whole system simplified. Its scientific name was first formally described in 1815, and the type locality, the place where the species was originally documented for Western science, was Lake Ipoa in Paraguay, just south of Asunción. Paraguay was not just part of the marsh deer's range. It was the place where European naturalists first encountered the animal. But by the late 20th century, the species has lost 65% of its historical range. In Paraguay, the collapse was especially brutal. The Paraguayan Chaco, which makes up 60% of the country's land area, experienced some of the highest deforestation rates in the world. Between 2012 and 2017, the Chaco lost native vegetation at an average rate of more than 540 hectares per day. That is more than 200,000 hectares per year. Cattle ranching and soy production drove the clearing. Roads followed the ranches, and the roads opened wetland areas to hunters, who had previously been unable to reach them. The marsh deer was already vulnerable. It is susceptible to diseases carried by domestic cattle, including foot and mouth disease, brucellosis, and babiosis. Hydroelectric projects along the Parana River had drowned some of the largest remaining habitat patches in Brazil. In Argentina, only about 2,000 individuals survived. mostly in the Ibera marshes. In Uruguay, the species had been extinct since the late 1950s. In Paraguay, the situation was worst of all. The Niambuku Wetlands Complex, the largest wetland system in the country, at roughly 8,000 square kilometres, was losing vegetated wetland at a rate of 1.65% per year, according to remote sensing studies conducted by researchers at Paraguay. The marshes were being converted to dryland for agriculture. The remaining marsh deer had nowhere to go. By the mid-2000s, the only confirmed viable population in all of Paraguay clung to the flooded savannas of the Pantanal region along the Rio Negro in the far northeastern corner of the Chaco. It was the last swamp, and it was not protected. The person who decided to change that was Alberto Janoski, the founder of Gaira Paraguay, the country's most prominent conservation organization. Janoski was not a romantic. He was a pragmatist who understood Paraguayan politics and knew that the government lacked both the resources and institutional will to enforce environmental protections in the remote Chaco. He proposed something that many colleagues had considered unrealistic. Rather than waiting for the government to create a protected area, Gaira Paraguay would acquire the land itself, establish a private reserve on the banks of the Rio Negro, and physically control access to the last marsh deer habitat in the country. The idea was met with skepticism. The land in question was remote, accessible only by boat during much of the year, and surrounded by cattle ranches whose owners had little interest in conservation. Poachers operated openly. There was no road infrastructure to support ranger patrols. Janoski argued that the remoteness was actually an advantage. If they could close the few dirt roads and tracks that hunters used to access the wetland during the dry season, and station rangers at the river entry points year-round, they could create a de facto exclusion zone around the marsh deer habitat. It would not require fences. It would not require expensive infrastructure. It required controlling access. That was the key insight that changed everything. In 2006, with funding from the World Land Trust in the United Kingdom, Gaira Paraguay established the Chaco Pantanal Reserve, protecting 14,600 hectares of Pantanal wetland along the Rio Negro. In 2008, the organisation built the Three Giants Biological Station. Named for the three iconic threatened species the reserve was designed to protect: the marsh deer, the giant anteater, and the giant river otter. The station was located 40 kilometers from the nearest town, Bahia Negra, accessible only by boat along the Negro River. That isolation was deliberate. The first thing the rangers did was close every dry season track that led into the reserve from the surrounding ranches. These were not formal roads. They were rutted paths through the scrub that hunters had used for decades to drive trucks and motorcycles into the wetland during the month when the water was low enough to traverse. The rangers blocked them with fallen trees and earthen berms, then set up a rotation of armed patrols along the perimeter. The monitoring protocol was simple but rigorous. Camera traps were installed across the reserve at water crossings, game trails, and the edges of forested islands where marsh deer were known to shelter during high water. Rangers conducted weekly foot patrols through the flooded grasslands, recording every sighting of marsh deer and noting the presence of fawns, which indicated active breeding. They recorded signs of poaching, illegal grazing, and fire. Every data point went into a centralized database maintained at the biological station. The early results were not dramatic. In the first 2 years, camera traps recorded marsh deer sporadically. The animals were there, but they were wary, mostly nocturnal, and confined to the deepest parts of the wetland, where human access was most difficult. Researchers noted that the deer had shifted their behavior in response to decades of hunting pressure. They were avoiding open areas during daylight, feeding at night, and startling at the sound of boat engines. This was a population that had learned to be afraid. The question was whether removing the threat would be enough to let them come back. The answer took about 5 years to become visible. By 2013, the camera trap data began showing something the field team had not expected. Marsh deer were appearing in daylight. They were using open floodplains again during the morning, and late afternoon, the natural activity pattern for the species, instead of restricting themselves to nighttime foraging. Fawn sightings increased. The biologists at the station started seeing small groups of 3 and 4 animals together, which in a species that is typically solitary or found in pairs, was a sign of population density rising to a level where overlap was becoming unavoidable. Here is a detail that rarely makes it into the conversation. When you remove poaching pressure from a marsh deer population, you do not just get more deer, you get a behavioral transformation. The animals shift from a fear-driven, nocturnal survival mode back to their natural diurnal rhythm. They spread out across the full extent of available habitat, instead of compressing into the deepest and most inaccessible corners. They begin using the seasonal flood pulse the way they evolved to, moving with the water across the floodplain, rather than hunkering down in one spot. And once they start moving freely, something else happens. They become ecosystem engineers. The marsh deer, at 130 kilograms, is the largest herbivore in the Pantanal wetland system. Its grazing keeps aquatic vegetation in check, preventing any single plant species from dominating the marsh. Its trails through the reeds create channels that allow water to flow between otherwise disconnected pools. Its hooves churn the substrate, mixing nutrients from the bottom sediment into the water column. And its dung deposits nitrogen and phosphorus into oligotrophic wetland areas that would otherwise be nutrient poor. Researchers working at the Three Giants Station documented that, as the marsh deer population recovered, the diversity of aquatic plants in the reserve's core wetlands increased measurably. Bird surveys found that wading species, which depend on the mosaic of open water and vegetation that deer grazing helps maintain, were appearing in greater numbers and in areas where they had not been recorded before. The reserve had been designed to protect 3 species, but the marsh deer was not just a beneficiary of the protection. It was the mechanism by which the entire wetland ecosystem was rebuilding itself. Scientists expected a slow, linear recovery. What they found was a threshold effect. For the first few years, the population grew modestly. Then, once the deer reached a certain density, the rate of recovery accelerated. More deer meant more habitat modification, which meant better forage quality, which supported higher reproduction, which produced more deer. The cascade went further. As the deer opened up channels through dense reed beds, caiman moved into areas they had not used in years. Capybara, the world's largest rodent and another key wetland herbivore, appeared in growing numbers along the river margins. Giant river otters, one of the 3 species the reserve was named for, were documented hunting fish in pools that had been choked with vegetation just a few years before. The deer cleared the reeds, the otters moved in. The otters ate the fish. The fish populations, freed from competition by the new habitat diversity, actually increased despite the predation. That is not a coincidence, that is balance. The system was rebuilding itself, not the way engineers rebuild things, the way nature rebuilds things. Slowly, then suddenly, by 2019, the reserve's monitoring data showed that the core wetland zones were supporting marsh deer at densities consistent with healthy populations elsewhere in the species range, comparable to the estimates of roughly 0.4 deer per square kilometre documented in the Brazilian Pantanal. The animals were not just surviving, they were expanding outward from the reserve boundaries into adjacent wetland areas that had been empty for more than a decade. Let me put that in context. A single marsh deer costs essentially nothing to maintain. It needs water, aquatic plants, and the absence of a bullet. It grazes, moves, defecates, and in doing so maintains the wetland ecosystem that provides flood regulation, water filtration, carbon storage, and habitat for hundreds of other species. The alternative is engineered wetland management, the kind that requires pumps, levees, herbicide application, and constant human intervention. That costs millions of dollars and requires electricity, maintenance budgets, and institutional continuity that a country like Paraguay simply does not have for remote Chaco wetlands. The marsh deer does it for free, around the clock, every day of the year. This is not romantic nature worship, this is hard-nosed economics. But the story does not end there, and it would be dishonest to pretend it does. The Chaco Pantanal Reserve protects 14,600 hectares. The Paraguayan Pantanal covers hundreds of thousands of hectares more. And outside the reserve, the pressures that nearly wiped out the marsh deer in the first place have not gone away. They have intensified. In 2019, wildfires damaged 60% of the reserve itself. The fires were linked to land clearing on neighbouring ranches, where burning is used to promote the growth of grasses for cattle. The rangers fought the fires with hand tools. There was no aerial support. No government firefighting infrastructure reached that far into the Chaco. The ranchers whose land borders the reserve are not villains. Many of them are small-scale operators, struggling to survive in one of the poorest and most remote parts of Paraguay. Bahia Negra, the gateway town to the Pantanal Reserve, has no paved road connecting it to the rest of the country. Supplies come by river. Employment options are limited to ranching, fishing, and the small tourism economy that the reserve itself has begun to generate. When conservation organisations close roads and restrict access to wetlands, the people who feel it first are the subsistence hunters and fishers who have used those areas for generations. The Yishir indigenous people, both the Ibitoso and Tomarajo communities, have lived in and around the Rio Negro floodplain for centuries. Their relationship with the wetland predates any conservation organisation by thousands of years. They fish the Rio Negro. They harvest wild fruits. They hunt. The creation of the reserve did not simply protect the marsh deer. It also changed the terms on which local people could use the land they consider their own. Gaira Paraguay has worked to include the Yishir communities in the management of the reserve. And the Reserve of Indigenous Heritage, known as the Yishir Tobich Reserve, sits adjacent to the national park. But the tension between conservation goals and indigenous sovereignty is real, and it is not resolved. The broader question is whether a model that depends on private organisations acquiring land and controlling access can scale to protect an ecosystem that spans international borders and hundreds of thousands of hectares. The Paraguayan government designated the Rio Negro area as a national park in 2004. But the park still lacks solid infrastructure, adequate staffing, and formal access management. On paper, it covers over 123,000 hectares. On the ground, it is Gaira Paraguay's 4 rangers and a biological station accessible only by boat that do most of the actual protecting. But go back to that flooded savanna in 2019. Stand where Karina Schiaffino stood, chest deep in water the colour of tea, and watch a herd of marsh deer feeding in the open for the first time in a generation. Their broad webbed hooves barely dimple the mud. Their chestnut coats catch the late afternoon light. A fawn, born without the spots that mark the young of most deer species, stands close to its mother at the edge of the reeds. Somewhere behind you, the sound of a boat engine fades as a ranger returns from patrol. The road that once led hunters to this place is gone now, swallowed by mud and vegetation and years of disuse. Nobody is coming down that road again, and most people have never heard this story. This is happening in one of the most remote corners of South America, and almost nobody is talking about it. What Paraguay proved with this experiment is something that conservation biology has been circling for decades. You do not always need to engineer a recovery. Sometimes you just need to close the road, stop the killing, then get out of the way. The marsh deer did not need a breeding program or a translocation plan or a genetic rescue. It needed a locked gate and 4 rangers who took their job seriously. Everything else, the wetland restored itself. The species that was formerly described for science from the shores of Lake Ipoa in Paraguay more than 200 years ago is still here, barely, and only because a handful of people decided that the last swamps was worth fighting for. What surprised you most about this story? Was it the webbed hooves? Was it the fact that a country with one of the highest deforestation rates in the world managed to pull off a recovery like this? Was it the cost comparison between a deer and a water treatment plant? Tell me in the comments. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories about restoration and the people who are fixing what is broken. Hit subscribe. See you in the next one.